Now we're going to take a look at our Primitives 2 tab, which is located right underneath our regular primitives. And you can see we have a bunch of different options in here. We have the ability to create a polygon, Ngon, star, pattern 1D, pattern 2D, and pattern 2D rot. Let's go ahead and start out with the Polygon Tool, which allows us to draw out a polygon similar to the pen tool in Lightwave, except that we have the ability to use our snapping options within LWCAD. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and let's just take a look at one of the functions we could use this for. I'm just going to create a box, a simple Lightwave box, and just delete our top polygon. And now we're going to move over to our perspective view, go back to the LWCAD 1, or the tab, first one, select polygon, and now we can go ahead and build our polygon by snapping to our points. Also notice that we have an autocomplete mode on right now. With autocomplete mode, we can see these different highlighted points in here. So now that I have the first 2 points selected, I can go in here and click on just this last point, and it will autocomplete our polygon. This works with a variety of different shapes. But first, let's take a look at this top command, which is what we have is weld mode. Weld mode would allow us to connect our polygon directly to our object without having to merge our points. So we can either choose to create a separate polygon that we can edit separately from this other object, or we can turn on weld mode and it will automatically connect itself to this object. Underneath that, we also have aligned to view. Now right now, turning this on and off really doesn't show anything, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at a different type of object. I'm going to hit the spacebar and delete our current object. We're going to go back to the Creative Elements tab. And if you're not using the Studio Production interface, then your ball tool will be located in a different tab, but still in the first one. And I'm just going to pull this circle out. I'm also going to go ahead and rotate this so it's facing upward, and I'm just going to delete our top polygons. I'm going to go back and take a look at our perspective. LWCAD tab 1, polygon, and now typically when you create a polygon, you want to go clockwise to have that polygon facing upward, and you go counterclockwise to have it facing downward, and that's really in relation to whichever axis you're working on. But for the most part, that's how it works. So what I'm going to do is actually work backwards in this case. So instead of going around this way, I'm going to move from left to right. And now you can also see we have our autocomplete on. And now we can click to any number of these points to create that polygon up to that value and up to that point. So we could either go all the way to the end, or we could go to the halfway point. And with specific objects, the autocomplete works great. Some more complex objects where there's a lot of curves, you might not see it really work out entirely. But I'm going to go ahead and turn off Align to View now, and we can see that our polygon disappeared in our perspective view, but that's because it's actually facing the other way. It's facing downward because of the way we selected those points. Just like we select points natively within Lightwave. But if I turn Align to View on, then it doesn't matter which way we've selected our points, because these will show up on the outside and correctly, pretty much no matter how in what order we select them. So if I turn this off and hit the spacebar, and we can take a look at our polygon, we can see that it's facing down. So it is there, but it's facing down. Hit F to flip that if we wanted to. But using that Align to View tool is very helpful if you haven't selected your points in the correct order. I'm going to go ahead and just clear this out now. Spacebar to eliminate our tool, and just hit delete. Our next tool that we have in Primitives 2 is an Ngon, which is similar to using the cylinder tool within native Lightwave. and it has the ability to create more polygon-like shapes rather than using the curves that we have where we're using control points and we have actual curves within LWCAD. So this way we can create more traditional style polygon type shapes that are circular. You can see we have both an edge mode and a center mode, and this allows us to either draw from the center outward or to specify a specific edge. And these are available once again for specific snapping options, so really depending on what it is you're snapping to, you might need one or the other. What we also noticed is that we have an edge count, and this is the way we can specify how many points we're going to have, or in this case how many edges. So right now we have 6 edges and 6 points, but I'm going to go ahead and just change this up to 20, and now you can see we have more of that traditional style cylindrical shape. So we can create some very interesting shapes with this, and it's a very useful tool. And the rest of the settings are pretty much straightforward. Go ahead and close that out. We're going to take a look at our next object, which is star. I'm going to start from the center and pull outward, and this is pulling out our tips. And now the next one we pull out is going to be our in-between areas. So right now we have a 6 tip count. I can change that up to 12. We have a 12-point star. We could do a 4-point star, or we could go pretty much as high as we want. I could do this up to 100. We could have a very interesting shape that way. And now all of these settings we can change. We also have an angle offset. I'm going to change this back down to somewhere around, let's do 20. And with this angle offset, we can have a nice twist rotation in the center. And it's we're really only able to change this while you're within the numeric panel. But it's usually best to do so anyway. We can also adjust our outer and inner radius within this panel as well. So mostly pretty straightforward, very easy tool to use, and most of these are. Go back down, and now you can see we have the rest of our primitives, which are pattern 1D, pattern 2D, and pattern 2D rot. Now these are directly related to our shape libraries, which means we can also create our own specific shapes, which I'll be showing you in the next part of the tutorial. But first let's take a look at our pattern 1D tool. Now within the numeric panel we can already see that all of our different shapes are showing up from the library we have selected. We can choose specifically by name, and right now all of these are just set to molding 01 through 18, and we can see a preview of all of these in our panel right here. If we go all the way down to the bottom of our numeric panel, we can see we can set our preview rows. And the more we increase this number, the smaller our previews are going to show up, so that way we can view more at once. If we want to see more detail, we can go down to 1 and actually see it pretty much full screen, or within this panel anyway. So let's just click and draw out one of our 1D shapes. So we'll draw out our first edge, and then we can pull out from there. And now at any time we can just go and click to change to any specific pattern that we want. Also note that all of these different settings that we have are all open-ended on the side. We can go ahead and change to a different library. We can take a look at the ornaments. But we notice that all of them are open-ended on that side. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind while you're designing your own shapes. We can we have our profiles as well. And now we're going to go up to the top. I'm just going to change this to a different shape. Let's go to Moldings 3 and select our third one. And you can see what we can also do is adjust our count. So in other words, how many of these shapes are we going to see repeated? So I can increase our count number. Let's go up to 4. And now you can see we have 4 of these objects being created and 4 of these shapes. And now this is the only pattern tool that we have that has the ability to create extra numbers of count. So we can go ahead and switch to any number of these and get exactly the kind of shapes we want to get out of it. So some very neat tools available here, and some very neat options that we have. And especially once we get into the drill tool in the next tab, you'll see how these shapes can do some really, really neat stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the space bar, and we can just delete that. And let's move on to our pattern 2D, which we're just going to pull out. And we can adjust the size of this one just as we pretty much do the rectangle tool. And that is actually the difference between our 2D and our 2D ROT. And that's because with our 2D ROT, what happens is we end up with a perfectly proportioned object. In other words, we cannot stretch it out. And you'll see that in just a sec. But we notice that we don't have a count number for this. And that's because these shapes are completely closed-end. And there's really no way we could replicate them. But now we also have an entirely different library of objects available. And these objects are really more symmetrical than anything else. Although we don't necessarily have to create a symmetrical object to have one of these tools. As you can see, some of these are not completely symmetrical, although this is basically the same in most of them. But it gives you the ability to create some different types of shapes. And now maybe you can see a little bit better why we have 1D versus 2D. So we can go through all the different varieties of shapes. We can do handrails. And like I said, you can also specify your own. And these really come in handy too once we get into some of the other tools, some of the more 3D tools, when we start actually creating shapes and modifying lines and objects and curves. But basically, if we're creating and working on a two-dimensional object, that's what these are available for. And we can use these, since we have our curve boolean, we can use these with our other objects as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit the spacebar, delete, and I'm going to create a rectangle. And now if I want to cut out an area of this rectangle with one of those shapes, I'm going to use our 2D. We're just going to pull out, move this down, and you can see we can either add to it, but I'm going to click subtract, and now we can subtract a shape from this specific polygon that we've created, or this rectangle of curves that we've created. It's a very, very neat way of creating objects, a very powerful way of editing them. And we also have the ability to use our snapping options within here as well. And we could show dimensions if we wanted. We could set this back to its original dimension. And we also have a couple other options. We have the ability to flip this horizontally or vertically. And since this shape is basically the same on both horizontal sides, we don't really notice a change. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to, let's go to our ornaments, and do something that's not exactly symmetrical. I'm going to change this to add, pull this off to the side so we can see it. Now if I click horizontal, we can see it switches back and forth. Same thing with our vertical. Okay, so I'm going to hit the spacebar, clear that out, and let's move on to our next pattern 2D ROT, and pull out our shape. Now you can see we're defining this by our initial edge. And beyond that, we really don't have the ability to change our specific shape. This is going to stay exactly the same proportions throughout. And we have our base length. And then we can edit our pivot, which is our position. We can do this on the y-axis as well. And then what we could also do is just click flip side, and that will cycle us through going back and forth depending on what side we want. So it's sort of a vertical flip. And once again, we can use these objects together with our different curve boolean options to create some very neat looking shapes, and we can be very precise about what it is that we're making. And like I said, we can also create our own shapes. And that's pretty much it for our primitives 2 section. So in the shape library chapter, we're going to cover how to create your own 1D and 2D shapes.